Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of September, and today we have an action-packed video. There are a lot of updates from the past 4 days. We'll begin with the Zaporizhzhia border region, where the Russian forces are continuing to advance at an increasing rate, taking over multiple villages since my last video. We're going to look at the lack of defenses and the lack of reinforcements. Then we'll move on to Pokrovka and the Kupiansk salient. I want to give a detailed explanation of the timeline of what's been going on for the past month and a bit of clarification about where the gray zone really is, where it has been for the past couple of days as well. We'll look at some new Ukrainian forces sent to the Kovcherevka fronts to help deepen their counterattacks, and we'll also look at the Russian reinforcements that are being sent in kind. We'll also, of course, focus on the battle for Siverskyi, the Siverskyi forest, Kupiansk, because there's another really important development from the Kupiansk region, or actually multiple of them that have developed over the past couple of days. So we'll zoom in on that city and the ongoing urban battle. We'll also look at Sumi by the end of today's video because there's also a Ukrainian advance over there. So let's begin. There's going to be a lot of details, so I'll just try to stay on track over here and not go on too many tangents. You can see over here that in yellow I have the advances since my last video, so it's been about 3.5 days or maybe 4 by the time this video is uploaded. You can see over here that in the yellow polygon, the southernmost one, the Russian forces have captured the village Olhivske, which amounts to 2.85 square kilometers of territory taken over. Here's a video from September 15th of the 114th Motor Rifle Regiment. It's a part of the 127th Division. They captured the village of Olhivske. I'm sure I have them somewhere over here on the map. But regardless of that, they were the ones actually involved in the capturing of this village, which just seems logical because beforehand, the Russian forces throughout mid-August and going into early September had established a very solid foothold in the tree lines and trenches just to the northeast of the village. And so they were able to uproot the Ukrainians from their fort positions that were largely detached from their main garrisons that are based out of Poltavka, for instance, and other villages that run upstream along the Yampil River, like Novovasilievsk and Novomykolaivka. And those are all future targets for the Russian side. The Russian side is currently in the midst of an offensive maneuver to squeeze the Ukrainians out of this river line, as I've been warning about for numerous months now. And you can see how it's already beginning to manifest, including with the capture of Olhivske, which will put further strain on this particular salient just to the east of Poltavka, which is only consisted of open fields at this point, meaning it's going to be harder to defend, but with an even larger emphasis on locations that are slightly to the north. So let's move up to here and look at this other polygon, because you can see how the Russian forces captured 23 square kilometers of territory. That is it's a significant amount within a couple of days. And that's due to the fact that, for one, the Russian side captured much of Novoivanivka. They've not taken over the entirety of this village, but their spearhead, this really important spearhead that pushes about 6 kilometers or 5.5 kilometers westwards, allow them to establish a foothold over here. You can see that on September 16th. This video is released by the Shadow drone units, and it confirms reporting from Deep State and other sources that the Russian forces were able to conduct this penetration. So they conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto those Russian soldiers as they were congregated in houses in one of the southern roads in this village. Now, what the Ukrainians did over here, or rather the Russians, was bypass most of the defensive fortifications built by the Ukrainians to absorb an attack that would come from the south or from the southeast. You can see how those defenses were built in such a manner to absorb that attack. So the Russian side, they saw that there was this opening over here, and it's a rather expansive one in between the second and first lines of defense, meant to protect a bottom-up attack on Zaporizhia and the Dnipro border as well. So this gap over here spans nearly 6 kilometers, or nearly 7 kilometers, sorry. And it's open fields. You know, you have these vertical tree lines over here. So again, a location that the Ukrainians weren't prepared to hold on to for an extended period of time, and a couple of hamlets as well, which the Ukrainians can't hold on to with any sort of significant force. And to the contrary, they become beneficial to the Russians because the Russians can actually congregate their own forward assault companies in those locations and then branch out from there using singular roads. And to the contrary, again, the Ukrainians have difficulties because there are only a couple of roads connecting between each individual village over here, meaning that logistics are constrained and the Russians have an ability to isolate forward Ukrainian elements. And so what we saw over here was an advance by the Russians along this main horizontal road that stretches out from the southern parts of Temerivka, and they were able to exploit this large opening in the Ukrainian line that was not necessarily the most fortified. It's in an open area, and the Ukrainians simply lacked the defenses over here when it comes to manpower as well. You have Ukrainian forces stationed further northwards along the Vavcha River, where you have the border between Dnipro and Donetsk, but you don't have the same degree of defensive density or the same quality southwards in the direction of the Yanchor River. And that's even after weeks of me sounding the alarm about this. Now, the thing is, I did some open source investigation, and I found that there's a potential that the 3rd Battalion of the 154th Mechanized Brigade was redeployed to this region, that they were redeployed around the village of Novomykolaievka around late August. That could be the case, but I'm just waiting for another piece of corroboration, but it's based on missing persons reports. So it appears as if at least a certain soldier from that battalion was fighting over here near the village of Novomykolaievka. And that would imply that the Ukrainians had already sent some reinforcements by late August, so over 2 weeks ago now. And despite that fact, it's been nowhere near enough to turn the tide at all. In fact, the problem was only compounded since then. And so either those reinforcements were rather meager, or they were more significant than any of us in the public have a grasp over. But nonetheless, it's not been enough to change the facts on the ground. So we now have this situation where the Russians are about to solidify control over Novoivanivka, and then from there can close in and squeeze the Ukrainians out of many fortified posts along the first line of defense of Zaporizhzhia, and thereby the Russians would really be reducing the amount of casualties, juxtaposed a scenario wherein they would only be attacking from the south, pushing northwards. And the ultimate goal is to arrive at the Yanchor River, at all these villages that run along it, and to push the Ukrainians out of them as well. And again, all with the intention of eventually reaching Huliaipoli, not just from the east, where you do have another opening, because this area over here certainly does look exposed to the west of Poltavka, but also from the north. This northern flank appears to be rather exposed as well. Now, the southern flank is protected when it comes to fortified posts. The western flank is also well protected because the second line of defense runs through there. But then you have these two gaps over here that are rather conspicuous, and so the Russians are taking advantage of that. Looking northwards, though, the Russians captured the entirety of Novomykolaievka. This amounts to 3.3 square kilometers of territory. This video from the 37th Motor Rifle Regiment captured, where they captured their 5th settlement in Dnipro Oblast, because they had already captured 4 others before this point. And I don't think it's regiment, actually. I believe it's the brigade, 37th Brigade. So I'll have to correct that. But in any case, they were able to take it over. And when it comes to the entirety of the village, it's a push of about 3 kilometers northwestwards. And as a result of this Russian maneuver, the Ukrainians that continue to defend in Berezheve have been put in a precarious situation. There's even an open-ended question as to whether the Ukrainians remain in control of Berezheve, but for now, I'll contend that the Ukrainians are there until proven otherwise. The Russians have pursued this northern flank west of Chernove and concurrently advanced from Zaporizhzhia, wherein the 57th Brigade established forward positions, and then with the help of the 135th Assault Battalion, was able to launch this foothold in Novomykolaievka. From there, they've been able to take over the rest of the village, and at the same time, the road leading into Berezheve. At the same time as well, to add on, they've also been able to bypass the second line of defenses, because you do have fortifications over here that theoretically you could have Ukrainian infantry within embedded that have to be rooted out. And so a lot of those areas were circumvented, and as a result, the Ukrainians were not necessarily isolated in these locations, but were put in a cauldron that forced them to withdraw. And this is one of the ways in which the Russians have been able to mitigate the effects of having to overrun these defenses by not doing so head on and doing so through flanks and other means. It also means now that the Russian forces have access to this paved road running basically parallel along this diagonal location to the second line of defense in Zaporizhzhia, and they can therefore have access to an area like Kalinivske and Verbove going forward. So there are a lot of opportunities now to overrun further hamlets going westwards, to take additional control over the second line of defense, and then to sort of anchor northwards and ensure that there is cooperation with the same forces that took over Sosnivka to get control over the entire countryside. So this merger between, say, the 57th and 37th Brigades along the southern axis over here, and then the over here to the north slightly, 36th and 336th and 5th Tank Brigade, all of them stationed around this particular location. It will spell the end of this salient and, by extension, all of the other ravines, open fields, tree lines, ridges, small hills, and various hamlets that span from the current line of contact all the way up until the line south of Pokrovka, and more generally, all of these other holdings that are to the south of the Vavch River, including ones that are pretty close to Pokrovka and Veliko Mikhailivka. So you're looking at this location, which I would say, just off of my own estimation, just surface level, probably spans like 200 square kilometers in extent within Dnipro Oblast alone. And it's extremely exposed because you just have a complete lack of fortifications meant to absorb an attack from the east, and you don't have proper reinforcements. You don't have an important anchor, and say a fortified outpost, even single one, a single major one that's a part of a network. You don't have a major village on the southern side of the Vavcha River that can be used as an anchor for a large group of reinforcements, or for forward rifle battalions, forward mechanized battalions, assault battalions, whatever it may be. And that means it's ripe for the picking for Russian forces. And I don't think it's due to the fact that the Russians want to then expand deeper into Dnipro northwards. That's certainly something that would go hand in hand with like a Novopavlivka operation, but that's secondary to the overarching objective of creating such a strong leverage position north of Zaporizhia that can then be used to anchor southwards, to take a detour southwards, and then expose Hulepoli in its weakest position. And not just Hulepoli, but all of the other positions in Zaporizhia that otherwise would have had to be attacked from the south. And I think this is a maneuver that the Russians are looking at, exploiting in the coming months. And it's something that is probably more possible than many of the other planned Russian offensive actions, because of the lack of fortifications that can be used to drag out the fighting, and due to the fact that there already is momentum for the Russian side over here. They already have a tiny garrison that's been involved in storming numerous villages around here, and the Ukrainians have simply not had the initiative yet to redirect forces from elsewhere to try to close down these advances, to put a stop to them. There's simply been a lack of initiative from the high command. I just have not seen enough warning alarms, warning bells sounded by the Ukrainian side about the potential effects of allowing this to continue metastasizing for them. But let's look over here at the Vavch River along the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. Russian forces have captured another 6 square kilometers, pushing about 5 kilometers westwards in this particular case. On September 14th, they recaptured the Andrivka Klevtsove cell tower. So the village is also referred to as Iskra by the Russian side. And so the village of Iskra now is contested with the Russians in the southern parts, and the Ukrainians in control of locations closer to the riverbank in the northern sections of the village. So it is split. Same thing with Zeleny High, wherein it's largely split between the northern section, wherein the Ukrainians are still present, and then the southern chunk is a gray zone. Although now, with the Russians beginning to return to previously abandoned positions, including in Tolstoy, where they've been able to really beef up their presence, and also around Novokhatske, it does mean there's going to be a new attempt to regain control of Zeleny High. We've already seen them. We got control over the eastern bank of this small inlet. I don't even know if it can be considered a body of water at this point. It lacks any sort of depth or width, but there is a sort of floodplain running that extends out of the Vavch River over here. And so all of the positions to the east of this particular tributary were taken over, which amounts to 3.16 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russian side, and it's about 2 kilometers pushing northwards. So again, these sort of excess positions where you don't really have a major fortified post or a sort of large forested plantation to anchor off of are being taken back by the Russian side. Also over here, we can see that there has been an interesting advance by the Russian side. You could see that This is actually not the complete advance. I need to pause the video to show you guys the full extent. So this more accurately reflects the present situation to the southeast of Novopavlivka. And I think this makes a lot of sense because for a while I've been reading missing persons reports from the Horikovo direction, and they haven't necessarily been clear about whether it was in the village itself or if it was in the general vicinity. And it appears as if there was it appears as if there wasn't an ability to actually accurately discern where the line of contact was over here, because the sort of location in between Novopavlivka and Horikova, this salient over here, not salient, but just corridor, this roughly 9.3 kilometer wide corridor is just completely open, and there's no reference point over here. Like, there's no plantation over here, there's no farm, there's no houses. It's just open plots of land, and so there's no way for a civilian on the ground to be able to report to people on the rear, to report to, journalists, military bloggers about what's going on over here, because there are no civilians present in these open fields. It's just an open wasteland. It's a gray zone. It's ambiguous. And it appears as if most of the fighting was done in plantations to the west of Horikovo. And this might have been the case for a while. And just gradually, the Russians continued chipping away at possessions, including fortified posts that were west of the border, even though that was not known to most of the people that were tracking the line of contact over here, because there weren't many geolocations either. And again, even if there was a video released, it's difficult to get an accurate geolocation when all these various plots of land appear to be rather similar. So there just was a lot of monotony about this part of the front line, and now that's changing for the first time, which is why I'm even talking about this with any sense of enthusiasm or interest. But you can see over here how it's 5.8 square kilometers of territory captured, and this appears to be an important shift when it comes to the sort of pace of Russian advances over here. So they were able to push 3 kilometers westwards, and I think this has been building up over time. I don't think this was just spontaneous advance, but it does imply that the Russians are within Dnipro Oblast, clearing out fortified structures that are part of the defense line meant to absorb an attack from the south, such as an attack wherein the Russians cross over the Vavch River and then advance along this highway. And the goal is to protect the southern flank of Novopavlivka. And so at the same time, you have this eastern approach by the Russian side where they're trying to take over the fortifications from the east, and thereby, preventing or nullifying any sort of advantage that the Ukrainians would have had by holding on to it to sort of anticipate an attack by the Russians from the south. So it's a way of just opening the gateways for a future assault onto Novopavlivka, even though it's extremely difficult due to the sheer amount of distance between where the current front line is and the village itself, and of course all of the fortifications around its immediate perimeter. And so the solace for the, I suppose, Russians in this case would be the fact that there aren't that many anti-tank ditches and trenches that were dug in the 9 kilometer corridor that I was referring to previously. When it comes to the Kovcherevka region, I suppose that's what I'm calling it now, the Kovcherevka direction, or maybe we should call it the Rodinsky direction if we're looking southwards. We can begin over here because there is additional footage coming out now, and this is from September 14th. This was released by the 503rd Marine Battalion, just of FPV strikes by the Russian side, or on the Russian side by the Ukrainians, onto 2 Russian soldiers, I believe, or may have been a couple more, small squad, 3 to 4, that tried to enter into a ventilation shaft. It's called ventilation shaft number 2, associated with the Stakhnov mine, which is the large mining network that is also present to the northeast of Mirnorod and also spans along the entire eastern bend of the city. So the Russians have been entering into some of those shafts in recent weeks, along with other agricultural buildings, warehouses. There's a power station nearby that has not been taken over yet, but it appears as if the Russians are just trying to bypass the line of contact, where there appears to be a lot of fluidity along the Konstantynivka River Valley. It appears to be an area that's difficult to penetrate through. The Russians found a very narrow access to penetration where the Ukrainians simply did not have the necessary infantry to bog down that attack in time, and now they've been able to pay for themselves an even more intricate route that allows them to bypass the Mikhailivka sector or fighting the west of the pond, and just immediately reach the outskirts of Myrnihad near areas like what is this here over Balakhan, Kozatske, Promin, those sort of locations. So one by one, the Russians are beginning to clear out those fortified outskirts with the intention of then, setting up the conditions to close in on Myrnihad. But preferably, the Russians would like for the Ukrainians to withdraw on their own or be forced to withdraw due to an advance that occurs along the flanks and not a direct entrance. But for now, you can see how they took over 1 square kilometer, and looking at the advance southwards, it's about 1.3 kilometers. So apparently, and this is what a lot of Ukrainian sources are talking about, the Russian activity over here has shifted towards sending DRGs between the northern outskirts of Myrnihad and Chervony Liman. So this 1.5 kilometer corridor appears to be the new nexus of Russian DRG activity. And so it may be more accurate to show that some of these areas are a gray zone. First of all, there's a lot of FPV coverage by the Russians along the road between Pokrovka and Myrnihad, which has been a particular focus of theirs recently. But also small squads are beginning to infiltrate into these areas. It's not concrete, which have not changed the map, but they're pushing in this direction. And the goal would be to sever the connectivity between Pokrovka and Myrnihad, and therefore the entire salient, and that would create a new layer of chaos that would be even more intimate. So that's a bit of an update on the situation over there. We've seen a large operational pause, especially in like late August, but it's gradually starting to resume. I suppose the Russian intensity is starting to go up, but nowhere near what it was beforehand. Now, zooming in on the Kovcherevka pocket, as I refer to it, we can see that it appears as if there is a solid line of contact. That's how it would seem at a surface glance looking at this map. But we know that there is a lot of fluidity over here. This is actually the most ambiguous parts of the entire line of contact across the entirety of the stretches of front line from, say, Sumi all the way to Kherson. This is the area where there's the most ambiguity, the most question marks. So I'll begin with what we know, and then we'll get into some of the reports. So the Russians captured just a small sliver of territory based on a video from September 15th of the 4th Freedom Force Battalion of the 4th National Guard Brigade conducting FPV strikes on the 2 Russian soldiers as they were entering into Volodymyrivka. Then over here, we saw 1.63 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russians as they're approaching Volodymyrivka and Shakhove from the east. This video is from September 16th and shows the redeployment of the 2nd Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, previously stationed around Unikivka and Sumi, but now it's been deployed to this particular location to stave off Russian assaults from the eastern flank, trying to arrive at the Kazani Turets River Valley. Moreover, the 225th Assault Regiment has been redeployed from its previous positions along that border region in Dnipro and Donetsk. So that's another concern because that was a really important unit for them, but it's been redeployed to defend over here in the Kazani Turets River region. And the Ukrainians from this unit do claim that they were able to retake Pankivka. So keep an eye out for any sort of videos that may come out from that region to confirm the veracity of those statements. Moreover, the 1st National Guards Corps, Azov, also announced that Pankivka was retaken. So that would appear to be a part of a concerted effort by the Ukrainians to challenge the base of the Russian salient that spans from, say, Nikhanorivka or Mayak all the way up to Kovcherevka. It's about 11 kilometers. So instead of just head-on attacking, which appears to be difficult and unnecessarily costly, the Ukrainians are trying to undermine the base, which could inflict even deeper damage onto whatever Russian forces are located to the north. But so far, there's been no confirmation of a full cutting off of the Russian forces, either in Novoshachove, any of the mines or quarries to the north, and then, of course, Kovcherevka itself. We know that some Ukrainian sources talk about a large gray zone in the direction of Novocherevsk. Again, something that could be the case. We're going to remain open-minded about this because there is a large amount of censorship from both sides when it comes to videos being published, because they know they'll be geolocated and then be used to get a better and more lucid idea of where the situation itself. And neither side wants to assist the other when it comes to granular details right now. And then there may also be some sort of Ukrainian penetration just to the west of Pankivka, in addition to the claimed capturing of the village. So those are some of the allegations from pro-Ukrainian sources spreading right now. When it comes to the, I suppose, apex of the Ukrainian counterattacks, we can say they started around the 16th to the 17th of August. The Ukrainians pushed in two particular locations, one of them being from Vilny, and the goal was to cut off Kovcherevka's southern flank in a closer location, pretty close to the village itself, as you can see, just south of this clay mine over here. That was one of their objectives, and they were able to push the mantle to the east, but they were not able to actually cut it off. But there was a bit of a debate about this. Perhaps they were able to do so for a couple of days during late August. So that the core, the jury still remains out on that. And at the same time, there was another concerted push from Novoshachove southwards, and the goal would have been to cut off the base of the salient yet again, but this time from the western side. So again, this sort of initiative was spearheaded by the 12th and 14th National Guard brigades, and they are still the ones that are primarily involved in the frontline engagements over here, and they're doing so most likely with the 1st Assault Regiment Da Vinci. You can see them over here. And that's why my map, I'm trying to do the best to show that it is connected, that there aren't any holes in the map, but that does not accurately reflect the situation over here, and it doesn't really account for the fact that there is a lot of fluidity on a day-to-day basis. One example of that is this video over here from the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. They conducted an FPV strike onto a Ukrainian BTR-4 to the east of Konstantynivka. You can see this is literally at the center of the base of the salient. It appears as if some of these videos coming out of these deep penetrations by the Ukrainians, including some that occurred around Zatishok, Fedorivka, Boykivka, they were more so around early September, late August. And since then, we saw the redeployment of the entirety of the 51st Combined Arms Army, the redeployment of the 20th Division within the 8th Combined Arms Army, and then within the 20th Division, like I'll give specifics about the units involved. We have them over here on the map, like the 33rd Regiment. They were one of the most notable. And there are a couple of others, like the 242nd Regiment. I know they're deployed somewhere over here. And there are other units as well that came in as supplementary and auxiliary forces. In addition to the fact that, of course, we have this new contingent of Marine brigades and regiments that have been redeployed in recent weeks. And they have not made their, I suppose, official debut yet when it comes to the frontline engagements, perhaps with the exception of the 155th Brigade, which has been sort of active in mechanized assaults towards Munirad. But that beefing up of the Russian side during early September that's beginning to manifest itself now, it provided the Russians with a window of opportunity to reverse some of those Ukrainian advances. And it is true that the Ukrainians themselves tried to reverse tide yet again by launching mechanized assaults on September 12th. And those ones were also in the area sort of between Vilny to Tovapalka, this park region over here with all those tree lines. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are doubling down on their redeployment of forces to this area with the intention of fully clamping down on the salient, perhaps cutting it off, or at the very least, just trying to push the Russians out. They wouldn't be doing that. They wouldn't be redeploying forces to such a degree if that wasn't the desired intention, although it could be possible that the Ukrainians are aware of the fact that the Russian push from the east is more devastating than is actually conceived on the map, and that perhaps the Russian advances over here, the seizing of all these heights that overlook the river valley, they actually may be an existential threat to the entire Ukrainian possession in this region, spanning from Volodymyrivka all the way up to Toretsk. All of the Ukrainian efforts to cut off the salient may be eventually stymied by the fact that the Russians have refocused their efforts on the eastern flank and may cut off the Ukrainian side or squeeze them out from the east. And that means that this entire time there was this massive fixation on the salient to the west. But the sort of irony would be that from the east, a new salient formed that was able to squeeze the Ukrainians out. So again, that's certainly a possibility. And that could be a part of why the Ukrainians are redeploying forces to this region. And there may be new ones announced as well, depending on the course of the battles over here. but certainly a lot of the air assault elements have been redeployed. Now, looking at Konstantinivka, short, brief update from this area. One video shows that on September 13th, the Vertovi drone group of the 36th Marine Brigade and also the Alliance Group conducted FPV strikes onto Russian vehicles and a house in the Yagoda Gardening Cooperative. So 3.6 square kilometers of territory captured. Russian forces on the ground already within the gardening cooperatives to the southeast of Konstantinivka. So they're getting very close to the city limits, both from the southeast and from the northeast. Over here, the Russians have expanded past Zaporizhzhia, are taking over fortified posts that are sandwiched in between Zaporizhzhia and the first outskirts, the outlying parts of Konstantinivka. The distance between the line of contact and the perimeter is only about 2.5 kilometers. This video from September 16th shows the 5th Assault Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto those fortifications wherein the Russians had entrenched themselves. And now looking at Siversk, there are two updates from this region. First of all, the Russians have taken over a large chunk of the outstretched salient south of Pokrovka and Zaporizhzhia. A lot of these locations are forested in nature, so they were difficult to clear out, and they're also on high elevation, meaning the Russians will now utilize them in order to, first and foremost, clear out the remaining sections of the salient, but also to then overlook Siversk, which is located on rather low elevation. Furthermore, around the 14th, I believe, we had the reporting from Deep State that the gray zone extended all the way up to here, that Russian small groups spanning from 2 to 3 men were able to infiltrate the eastern line of defense that you see over here on the map, this zigzag formation shape, that they were able to bypass these DRGs and seep into the northern outskirts of Siversk, seep into some of the local mines, some of the local industrial centers over here, and there may also be some individual dugouts. So none of that actually means that they've been able to consolidate their advances, but certainly you guys should be aware of the fact that there probably were some Russian DRGs present in this particular location, meaning that the Russians have been able to find a weak point in the Ukrainian defensive line. It's not directly to the east, of course, but to the north, there appears to be a liability. And so now the Russians are beginning to close in based on the recent advances to the south of Zaporizhzhia. And the goal will be to bypass fortifications north of Siversk and then curl back down and attack the city from that northern flank. Moreover, in Zaporizhzhia Forest, we can see that about 5.57 square kilometers of territory has been retaken by the Russian side. And yeah, it's retaken. So what we have over here is the fact that Russians from the 36th Motor Rifle Regiment have created this substantial wedge that separates the Ukrainian possessions to the east over here that are pretty much along the northern bank of the Donetsk River, and then the western side, which would be the rear around where Yampil is stationed, and then the outskirts of Liman. So they were able to create this wedge between the rear forces and then the front line units from the 53rd Brigade, for instance. But there were also there's like the 119th and the Pomsta Brigade, which is a part of the 3rd Border Detachment. So this wedge forced most of the Ukrainian forces to withdraw westwards to Yampil in order to prevent encirclement. But some of the Ukrainians still remain present in this location over here that is, again, very difficult to withdraw from at this point. There's a very narrow corridor of escape along the northern bank of the river. So the best option now for whatever Ukrainian remnants remain over here would be to cross over the river and try to regroup around the nearby mines or around Zornivka, and then from there anchor southwards to Siversk. But it appears as if the goal is now to force the Ukrainians westwards, to push them westwards, and ultimately that would be in order to create the conditions for a river crossing. The Russian side wants to cross over the river over here and connect with the Ukrainians in Zaporizhzhia, the Russians in Zaporizhzhia, and then push from the north southwards towards Siversk. That's the ultimate intention over here by taking over the remnants of the Zaporizhzhia forest. Concurrently, there's also the objective of taking over Yampil. Yampil is in a gray zone partially. The Ukrainians withdrew their forward assets to this location in order to create a new defensive anchor, but that was not done in a sufficient amount of time because we have this video over here from September 15th Deep State claims that 2 Russian soldiers entered into Yampil dressed in civilian clothing. I don't know if that's true or whether they're actually just civilians that live over here. But regardless, if we take them at their word, it would imply that the Russians are actually present over here in eastern Yampil, and there is a route being used from the border between Donetsk and Luhansk, and then from there connected to the rail line, and from there to the rail station and all of the subsequent houses in Yampil. So this area has already been undermined, meaning it cannot be used as a safe, defendable location that can drag out the fighting for a while. So the Ukrainians are going to have to withdraw even further westwards, and there are no nearby positions that can be used to the same degree of effectiveness as Yampil could have. Because you have Zaporizhzhia and Ozerny, but they're to the south. They're pretty close to the river itself. They're not necessarily protecting the flanks of Liman from the east, and they're far away from Yampil, meaning that a lot of territory, a lot of forested areas would be ceded in the process. So now it's just a matter of waiting for confirmation about the extent of the Russian advance, because some Russian sources claim that they've been able to advance directly north of Yampil. A lot of the Siverskyi forest is no longer solidly under Ukrainian control. A lot of the forested strips don't have the foliage anymore, meaning that it's easier for Russian drone crews to spot the Ukrainians and to push them out of particular locations. But either way, I know Russian sources, some of them have maps that indicate that everything south of Torska is under their control, and therefore the northern flank of Yampil is also within their grasp. But for now, I'm going to wait for any additional confirmation of that via Ukrainian reports or geolocation or anything of the sorts, because we don't have it yet. But again, keep an eye out for the eastern flank of Liman and the northern flank of Siversk. And then to finish off with Kupiansk and Sumi, you can see there are 2 updates from Kupiansk. So you have this advance that is about 7 hectares in extent, and we can see over here that the Russians continue advancing along the rail line into Kupiansk. So this video from September 16th shows that the 19th Special Purpose Center had conducted grenade drop operations onto houses in northwestern Kupiansk. And we have this other video from over here, September 14th, of the Chorna Krilo units, which is a part of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, conducting FPV strikes onto Russian forces in the Kupiansk public hospital. So again, 0.6 square kilometers of territory captured, and an advance of about 700 meters southwards. The Ukrainians are being squeezed out of their entrenched positions within the Spartak Stadium and in nearby high-rises, and the Russians are doing so by just really hugging the pitch line over here of the Oska River and continuously advancing over there, and by really having their deepest penetration access being along the river in an area that's not as defended. There aren't as many well-built fortified structures or large buildings like apartment blocks or houses to defend in. It provides the Russians with an opportunity to push through that area or the nearby road. I think it's called over here Vulitsia Michurnia or Mucherino. So those more rural locations are up for the taking. They're more difficult to defend. And then the Russians can just sort of like pull back or hook back to the left, or to the west in this particular case, and collaborate with the western flank over here, with the forces advancing along the rail line to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the center of their built-up positions within this citadel region. And the goal is, in terms of what the Russians achieve, or intending to achieve rather, is to arrive at downtown Kupiansk and cut off the access points to the eastern side of the river, and thereby provide more isolation, further increase the impetus on the eastern bank of the Oska River, and the impetus would be for them to withdraw, to try to pressure them into withdrawing before all of their access points, all of their bridges are cut off. So right now, the Russian campaign is solely focused, or squarely focused, that's a better way to describe it, on clearing out that western bank of the river and that western chunk of the city. Moreover, 2 square kilometers of territory were captured north of Stepovo-Novoselivka. It appears as if, due to the Battle of Kupiansk being so contentious, nearby regions that are to the east of the Oska River will be more exposed now, especially a lot of these open fields and outstretched pockets. It's just not going to be possible to hold on, as infantry is desperately needed in Kupiansk itself. So here we have the Nebezhny Mara units, a part of the 43rd Brigade, conducting FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers in those trenches recently taken over by them. Now, to finish off with the front line in Sumi, just a minor update. The Russian side has been pushed back yet again. This time, the Ukrainians have been able to retake the entirety of Konstantynivka, and the splitting off point of this particular body of water into two separate watersheds. And so about 4 square kilometers has been retaken by the Ukrainians. They're getting very close to Konstantinivka and to the border between Kursk and Sumi. It's an advance of about 2.4 kilometers northwards. And again, Oleksivka is now in an extremely tenuous position, both from the east and from the west. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.